Hello and welcome to this talk at NDC Sydney, where we'll be covering communication and the skills you'll need to thrive in this remote-first world. We're going to look at communication from two main perspectives, people and process. We're going to start by looking at culture and see how it really needs to form the core of any effective communication strategy. From there, we'll look at process, and we'll look at process from three levels. First of all, as it pertains to organization-wide comms, then team level, and then finally, individual or colleague level. For organizations, we'll look at communication architectures and the broader guidance required to promote the effective sharing of information and also how to do it efficiently. At the team level, we'll look at bidirectional communication, so two-way communication. We'll explore some of the available mediums or channels for this and assess the pros and cons for particular types of communication. Finally, at the colleague level, we'll look at a technique that you can employ to increase the visibility of your own work and champion change within your own organization. Before going further, I'd like to share a little bit about myself. So my name is Rob Crowley. I am the head of engineering at Vix Technology. And at Vix, we believe in a better customer journey. We believe in challenging perceptions around what transport in cities can be. And using transport domain experience and cloud native technologies, we deliver cutting edge mobility as a service and automated fare collection solutions. So as a point of reference, if you're familiar with the Mikey card in Melbourne, that was one of our previous solutions. Before working at Vix, I was a principal consultant at Telstra Purple, and the vast majority of my career has been in designing, building, and operating distributed systems. So in a way, I've always had an interest in remote communication. But if I start explaining some of the concepts using distributed terminology, then you'll understand probably what the reason for that is. I'm also the organizer of DDD Perth, along with another host of wonderful individuals. And that is WA's, Western Australia's largest IT conference. While we didn't hold an event in 2020, we're hoping to be back in 2021. And I'm also available on the socials at @RobDCrowley. So at the start of 2020, remote working was really the purview of a relatively small number of IT professionals. While many companies, Vix included, supported some form of flexible working, a fully remote-first model was very far from the front of our minds. But this all changed with COVID-19, and where many companies were forced to lurch into a fully remote way of working with very little preparation. So how did Vix respond? Like faced with any situation with emergent behavior, we sought to create feedback loops and better understand how we could improve. We also recognized that this wasn't a normal situation. We weren't simply trying to embed new ways of working. Our colleagues were trying to work from home in an incredible, stressful situation during a global pandemic. And we ran a number of surveys to collect qualitative data and also combine this with the quantitative data from the systems that we were building to build a full picture of what delivery was looking like in our organization. And from these surveys, we saw some quite surprising results. Despite the difficult circumstances, colleagues were adapting. 70% of our colleagues felt more productive working from home. After a number of months working from home, 92% of colleagues still felt aligned with the company mission and had the required context to operate effectively. And 84% of respondents felt empowered to do their roles. So the takeaway from here is clear that our people were thriving in this situation. And this is really gratifying because in a remote working environment, a leader has no choice but to trust their team members and start measuring outcomes rather than outputs. And this qualitative data collected from surveys aligned perfectly with the quality of the outcomes we were actually sending to customers. But there was room to improve. 60% of respondents felt that working remotely had not impacted the quality of their interactions with their colleagues. But for me, that meant 40 people felt it had. 40% of our respondents felt that it had impacted the value. This is what really started me on my journey around better understanding remote communication and what ultimately led to me giving this talk at NDC today. But the takeaways from the surveys was clear. Colleagues who had been working flexibly had increased their productivity, their work-life balance, and their feelings of empowerment. So the question then became, how could we make remote working a sustainable approach? So companies have benefits. We gain access to a larger pool of talent, no longer tied to a specific geographic locality. But colleagues have a huge amount of flexibility in the roles that they look after as well. So is it a potentially larger but less sticky talent pool? Could this lead to attrition down the line? But with the many positive aspects of remote working, I then looked at what could we do to improve the quality of communication across all of our teams. I will begin with culture, as failing to understand cultural differences will almost certainly undermine not only your own interactions, but also those interactions with your colleagues across the organization. Culture is really the key to achieving a shared truth. And I've used the term culture of communication a number of times in this talk already. So to ensure that we have a shared understanding or a shared truth, let's provide a definition. For the purpose of this talk, when I say communication, I mean the imparting or exchanging of information between two or more people by speaking, writing, or using another medium. So what do the community exchanges look like within VIX engineering? So within VIX, we have a global footprint. We have 4 main engineering hubs, one based in Perth, where I'm located, one in Melbourne, Besançon in France, Košice in Slovakia, as well as a number of colleagues working flexibly in Malaysia. And we also have a number of other teams, of which I've just put up a fraction, focused on customer solutions and operating systems across the world as well. And the first challenge that may be apparent from this map would be time zones. Sure, we have up to 10 hours difference between our Melbourne-based teams and those in Europe during certain parts of the year. And when you factor in a solutions team in the US, this can grow up to a staggering 18 hours. To add a little more color around this, within engineering alone, we have teams across 4 countries, over 100 team members, 3 different time zones with a time difference of up to 10 hours, and over 15 different nationalities. But I can tell you there are absolutely tougher challenges to overcome with remote working than temporal coupling. So I started my journey into understanding remote communication with this amazing book by Erin Meyer. This book shone such a huge light on certain areas that I was just completely ignorant or unaware of before, in particular how cultural patterns of behavior and belief can impact not only what we see or perceive, but how we think about actions or items, and also how we respond in terms of certain communication, and often in pretty major ways. So for instance, the practice of Americans generally wrapping negative feedback with positivity is one that is seldom employed by our French teams. And I had seen friction around this exact issue before. I just didn't recognize the root cause of it. It wasn't about individuals and individual behaviors, or when interacting directly with team members, not via their manager in a hierarchical culture, can then lead to certain friction as well. And this was all the insights about how to tailor my approach or leader's approach to given situations. And Gert Hofstadter has a wonderful description for culture. He calls it the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes the members of one group from another. And while Hofstadter was working at IBM, he did some pioneering studies into cross-cultural behaviors, and he gathered over 100,000 questionnaires from over 70 country divisions of IBM. And at the time he did this, it was one of the largest cross-national databases in the world. And from this, he drew some incredible insights. He's best known for the cultural dimensions theory, a framework for cross-cultural communication, in which he identified 6 dimensions, each of which focuses on a particular aspect of a culture. The original ones he identified were power distance, individuality, masculinity, and uncertainty avoidance. And then using these principles, I then mapped these and how they would pertain to the engineering landscape at VIX. So power distance, the power distance dimension focuses on the extent to which less powerful members of institutions or organizations within a country expect and accept the power is distributed unevenly. So again, in a high power distance culture, we're talking about status. So your level in an organization is very important in terms of how communication flows. It will typically be top down. But in a low power distance country, then it's very much relationship based and it's more ad hoc in terms of those communication patterns. There's less ceremony around status. And if you look at the teams at VIX, we have quite the spread. We've got a large grouping at about the 30 to 40% mark. So fairly low power around Ireland, the UK, America, and Australia. But then at the other end, we have Malaysia and we have Slovakia, incredibly high power distance countries. And this isn't around that dimension alone. If we look at individualism, we again see that a high level of individualism across a certain group of countries, Australia, the United States, and the UK, but again, spread across our other countries, with Malaysia being very low, so a high collectivism or group focus. It's actually been suggested that countries with a stronger focus on collectivism have been more receptive of lockdown restrictions during the pandemic than those with a stronger individual view. So again, in countries with a high level of collectivism, they see the identity in terms of we, whereas individualism has the concept in terms of I. And if we combine those two dimensions and plot them on a map, what we can really see is the level of distance between certain nationals from the team. And what you can see here is the relative distance between 2 points could be indicative of the strength of the communication challenges across those teams. And then it highlighted that when you're delivering a certain level of comms or updates, what do you need to do to tailor it to each one of those groups? Is one level of comms sufficient? Would I use a different medium? Would I add more context going through it? And these are certain things that we'll look at as we progress through the talk. In terms of the masculinity dimension, this is really striking at the fundamentals, what motivates us as people. In a masculine context, we want to be the best. We want to win. That overrides everything else. Whereas in a feminine-based country, it's about liking what we do, the purpose of it. And in a feminine society, the quality of life is a sign of success and standing out, not individual achievement. And again, we see quite a clumping in the middle where the UK, Australia, America, they're all in the masculine side, but not too much. And we have France and Malaysia a little bit on the feminine side. The clear outlier here is, again, Slovakia, where it's very much a be the best and win. And if you want an example of a country or a number of countries with a very feminine view on this, we can look to Scandinavia. So Denmark recorded a result of just 16 and Sweden just 5. The final dimension we'll look at is uncertainty avoidance. And this is really the extent to which members of a society are threatened by ambiguous or unknown situations. And they have crafted rules or beliefs to limit that uncertainty or to give them predictability. And again, we have France as the outlier here that has a lot of process and structure to avoid uncertainty in their workplace. So again, when you're tailoring comms, making sure that you can clearly identify these are the steps that we're going to take, here's the process around it, to be able to have that land more impactfully with the teams. And in terms of bipolar ends of this, we have Jamaica with just 13 in terms of this, so very low uncertainty avoidance, whereas Japan is one of the countries with the highest levels of uncertainty avoidance, way up at 92. And again, if we plot this on a graph, we can again see the distance. In this case, it clearly shows that I need to employ a different communication strategy when talking to my teams in France than I would to the teams in the UK. And again, modify it again for the communication between the teams in Australia and the teams in Slovakia. So again, all of this information is actually taken from Hofstadter's Insights, which is a URL that I'll share in the references at the end of the pack. So you can look up this for your own nationalities and your own countries, and then be able to see the relative distances between these as well. An interesting observation is that education actually tends to amplify the dominant values of a culture within an individual. So typically this will start in school and then be amplified throughout the workplace as well. So it's very much a nurture-based process that then gets reinforced to societal values as you progress through life. And when you look at this, one of the best advice I can give is that when you're talking to someone from another country or from another culture, you won't instantly be able to master, how do I mirror my style? How do I adapt my style? But watch more, listen more, and speak less. There's some clear guidance in terms of minimizing the use of colloquialisms, idioms, and localized expressions. And things are hard. Friction will occur, but one size does not fit all for cultures. We need to embrace our diversity and understand how we communicate effectively. And while I've been talking about cultures, there's many different items that make each of us different. And we shouldn't try to homogenize all these views. We should accept it and then embrace it. And misunderstandings are inevitable, but nip issues in the bud. Take feedback before they escalate. So around culture, so communication is hard. Cross-cultural communication is even harder. When you're looking at embedding remote communication, start with culture. And then once you understand how to adapt your style, then look at process improvements on the back of that. Hofstadter's dimensions illuminate the certain cultural values of countries and allow you to have better insight into how to adapt your style. And don't try to create a monoculture. That is just trying to avoid the problem, but it will hurt you in the long run. And disagreements and misunderstandings will occur. Take feedback and move on. With the foundations of culture in place, we'll now move on to what can we look at in terms of process, how the communication actually takes place within your organization. And I think it's fair to say that most companies don't actually have communication challenges. We often have miscommunication challenges. And one of the most significant challenges with communication is that it can be difficult to identify when it's not working well. We can get silence. And a remote working environment is particularly challenging in this regard, as many of the unofficial communication challenges which we relied on previously, water cooler conversations, corridor conversations, don't take place. So establishing effective communication patterns in a remote organization, that takes dedicated effort and planning. And the first point of this is to establish a communication architecture for your company. And the purpose of a communication architecture is to document a set of practices, principles, processes, and associated tooling for how or when people should communicate. And the intent of the communication architecture is to promote effective distributed decision-making across your teams for how colleagues communicate with each other. And this architecture should cover all of the tools, channels, including meetings and ceremonies, and when they should be used. And this is a model communication architecture. This will change based on your context. In this case, we're optimizing for more asynchronous forms of communication, where we want the majority of communication to happen within work management tools, collaborative tools, wikis. So moving towards asynchronous forms of communication, and email really being moved as not a primary channel for use. This would look very different if we had an organization which was co-located. You would see a lot more focus on in-person meetings around this. The key thing here is to codify the desired usage patterns for semi-synchronous tools. So that could be certain tools like email would fall into this, chat would fall into this category, collaboration tools such as Miro could fall into this. And that is really that the patterns that people bring in terms of communication will then be overlaid onto those. So unless we codify the use to say, we will use this collaboration tool, but in this particular way, existing behavior will take place. So you won't actually be changing the style of communication, only the medium through which it takes place. And this will take effort. And in this regard, leaders have to lead. So leadership in a remote company is responsible for deeply understanding the communication needs of work and then writing it down and leading by example. And this isn't just leaders in terms of status, but there's also unofficial leaders. So people who lead, unofficial leaders. And this can be just as powerful as having your CEO follow it. And an engaged HR team is a wonderful asset in this regard. They can help with training. So at VIX, our HR team created an entire training portal around adapting to remote working and the communication techniques that you would want to apply in this regard. So organization-wide communication then. The best thing we can focus on is providing alignment across our teams. And many companies have values. So the VIX values, accountable, collaborative, innovative, passionate, honest, and bold. They're good values, but in and of themselves, they're not very actionable. So what we need to do then is overlay a set of principles onto that. So the values will then drive the principles. And then the principles are codified in the communication architecture, but also in the other guidance in how we operate. And then ultimately that will drive the behavior or the actions that you have. So having this framework of foundations in place can greatly help when you're presenting communications across the organization, that there's already alignment to the mission or the purpose and how people respond in particular situations. And values alone are not sufficient. So if we look at Enron, so a previous Wall Street darling, and at one point in time, voted by Fortune the most innovative company in the US for 6 years running, it had a company values of integrity, communication, respect, excellence. But their leadership defrauded the regulators and ultimately lost billions of dollars and led to the introduction of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. So values can be a start, but to make them resonate, they have to be led by leaders. They have to be embedded through principles, and only then will we get the behavior that we want. So again, clear guidelines that codify the etiquette for organization-wide communication, what's acceptable, what's not, and not just the medium over which it takes place. And the level of detail that we specify in these documents will scale and change based on the maturity of the company and the size of the company. So a small startup might have quite a lean one-page set of diagrams. Maybe that's sufficient. Whereas larger scale companies or companies who have been working remotely for a long period of time can have a larger corpus of information available. So for instance, at GitLab, a company that has been entirely remote, its remote working guidelines are over 16,000 words long, so incredibly comprehensive and covers all facets of communication to incredible detail. You don't necessarily have to start there, but understanding about how it can build up over time and how your needs will change as your company matures. So when we talk about announcements, that's typically what happens at an organization-wide level. So one-way status updates. And what are the properties of an effective announcement? They should be referenceable. They should be clearly available. So we should be able to have a single link to point you to it. They should always be available to colleagues. They should be persistent. So why then do we often choose email for announcements when it absolutely has zero of these properties? Some of this is down to the ubiquity of email, that everyone has it. It's very easy to write an email and send an update. But there's some real issues with this in terms of long-term management of announcements. And again, that alignment that I spoke about. Email is decentralized, so there's no permanent record in a permanent place that everyone can see. So if you have a new starter join the company, they don't have a record of it. People organize their emails. If they delete the email, then it's gone as well. So for announcements, how would we start steering people away from email? Maybe to begin with, we don't. So the practice that I use is to still communicate or reach out in the medium that people are used to operating in. but then provide structured links that then drive people towards the content where you want them to access it from. And this is a tip that I learned from Tathan Audi at Telstra Purple, whereby it's not just a single opaque link, but it provides the structure that mirrors the access path within the application. In this particular case, it's the NDC website, but it could be SharePoint, or it could be any other tool that you use to manage these. And for bonus points, you can pay attention to content metadata tags to improve the searchability. So if you go into one of these tools, you should be able to find with a suitable word a curated link to find it again. So it's available and it's persistent. And again, those links make it referenceable. The other key point around messaging is context. Without context, it's just a series of words. And context can be tricky to pin down. Even simple sentences can have very different meaning based on the subtlety of words. And again, when you infer that there's many different cultural items and cultural contexts involved, this can become quite challenging. So as a leader, what I really want to do is hire great people and then give them the context that they need to be able to make good decisions themselves. So in a way, I'm looking at streamlining the comms and giving them the context that they need to then go away and do great things. So I cannot overstate the importance of context. So saying the right thing, but in the wrong place or without the proper details actually leads to misunderstandings or additional work. You might have to communicate it twice, so there's inefficiencies. So we need to be specific around the context of the update to ensure that we get shared understanding. And again, how we provide that context will need to shift or depend based on the target audience. But there is one piece of guidance that we can always keep in mind is start with why. So if anyone's familiar with the Golden Circle by Simon Sinek, it's the same sort of idea from there, that he states that everybody knows what people do. Some people know how they do it. That might be the unique experience or IP they have. But the purpose is often vague. And that's typically how we structure comms as well. So this is what we want to do. We're going to go and we're going to see great results. It's just difficult to then have it resonate with teams. It's not inspirational. However, the most inspiring leaders at Apple were amazing at this. They started with the why. So we want to change the world. We want to think differently. And then they worked back. We're going to create beautifully designed products. And then ultimately, we just happen to build machines. But you already bought into it emotionally. And we can structure comms the same way. So even in the intro slide, I didn't start with VIX saying, we build automated fare collection systems. I started with the purpose of VIX. I started with the why, the reason for being. And that's very deliberate. And that's the same techniques that you can apply to all of your comms as well. So Simon Sinek has a beautiful saying around this. Like, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And if you want to build alignment across all of our teams, they're exactly the same techniques. And it doesn't mean that if we're selling something, it can still apply the same techniques to inspiring, negotiating. Like, in a way, even this talk is a sales pitch. The product is your future time to invest in learning more about remote working when you leave NDC. And the amount that you spend on the why will depend on your target audience, but the structure will always remain the same. So if you write out your comms, then test whether it starts with the why, then the how, then the what. And in fact, this is a mirror of exactly what I described before in terms of the values, then the principles, and then ultimately leading to behavior. It's just the more generic version of that same advice. And there's a corollary to this starting with why, that the further you get from where the decision was made, the stronger the focus on the why needs to be. And this is about context again. The context might not be as clear or as concise the further you get away from where the decision was made. And that's particularly pertinent when you have an organization that might have a hub and spoke model. And if many of the decisions are being made in the hub, then you need to pay careful attention that sufficient context is provided to let the people on the edge understand that. And when you think about a fully remote context, everyone's at the edge. To augment text-based comms, short video messages are incredibly powerful. They're warmer. They show body language. You can see connection. So when we're doing larger comms, we will always have a short video message, just a couple of minutes, and then a longer form text update as well to apply to both audiences, because people consume or absorb information in different ways. And the timing of announcements is incredibly important as well. So particularly in a global context, write content when it's convenient for you, but then publish it when it's going to be effective for your audience. So typically, if you want to publish something first thing on a Monday morning, people are going to be busy checking their own email or getting prepared for their own week. They're not going to be receptive to an update. Likewise, on Friday afternoon or towards the end of the week, you might have the same level of cognitive load introduced. Typically aim for Tuesday, Wednesday, sort of being the ideal time for landing comms, but again, match it to the working cadence of your teams. So far I've been talking very much around effective comms. So how can we share sufficient context so we get shared understanding? We're now going to pivot slightly and looking at how do we make some of this efficient. And communicating extraneous information between teams is waste. So it's not always a case of communication more is better. You can't possibly over-communicate. You can't over-communicate the right content. You can certainly over-communicate the wrong content. And over-communication of information that is not germane to a team increases their cognitive load. It creates distractions. It creates additional areas that maybe they could be concerned about. Is this something that they now need to invest their time into? And one of the learnings I had was that team boundaries are absolutely critical in a remote working environment, more so than when all the teams were co-located. And there's another wonderful book that provides guidance on how we can shape the boundaries of our teams. And it's by Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pass, called Team Topologies. And there's a quote that really resonated with me from it. So the problem of taking the org chart at face value is that we end up trying to architect people as if they were software and neatly keeping their communication between accepted lines. So what we really need to do is, where was that communication happening? Where did it need to happen? And then forming our team boundaries around that. Not ignoring it, because the cost of poor communication in a remote working environment is exponentially higher than when we were all located in a single building. And the book defines 4 main team types or team structures. Stream-based teams that are aligned to a particular business vertical. At VIX, we have 2 types of stream-based teams. We have a business capability team, which would typically form part of the core functionality within an AFC solution. So it might be fair and product configuration or fair validation. But then we would also have true product teams. And for true product teams, we want to be able to make them as autonomous as possible, because they own the full go-to-market strategy. We have enabling teams, so teams that would exist for a short period of time to support a particular technical piece of work. So that's how I really drive significant architectural change across the portfolio. We could have complicated subsystem teams. So teams, if there's an area of the application that is particularly difficult to understand or technical. So in the case of VIX, it's crypto. So specialized deep domain expertise in that. And then finally, platform teams, about increasing the efficacy of the other team's ability to deliver. And this is an incredibly valuable topic for any team leader or leader to look at in general. But when you make the team interactions explicit, you can then count for where that communication happens. And you can also identify where communication is happening that it really shouldn't need to. So again, it provides insight into how your team's actually needing to communicate, and then reforming teams around that. Again, I'll include the link for this book in the references at the end of the presentation. So for organization-wide comms, communications require context, and sharing the why is absolutely critical. Choose channels for communication that have sufficient social bandwidth for the target audience. That might mean including videos in addition to text, or diagrams. Make it visual. And while effectiveness is the immediate priority, then start looking at inefficiencies and looking at ways to optimize around that. At the team level, we're going to look at more interactive or collaborating styles rather than the one-way updates that we talked about before. And in teamwork, silence is something that we really need to keep an eye on. It is not good. It could be masking very deep-seated issues within the team that are no longer visible. And this is challenging because the ability to communicate asynchronously is the single most valuable skill a team can learn in 2020. So that means not exchanging in-person meetings for video conferences as the default way of communicating. There's still temporal coupling. And when you consider teams working at many different time zones, the overlap might only be a couple of hours, or you're forcing your team members to work extended hours or strange working patterns to try to create these overlaps. And again, this should be reflective of the communication architecture that has been defined and the team's providing input into it. And the guidance is to always choose the most asynchronous channel that has the required social bandwidth to support the effective exchange of the information. And that could be start with a long form document, so a wiki page. So for any architecture changes, we use architecture decision records to then be able to promote collaboration, so a divergence of ideas, but then converging onto one singular approach moving forward. Again, long form and technical writing in particular can share code samples, diagrams, things that can actually be quite challenging to do in a video as well. It also allows certain ideas to breathe, to form, and people to reflect. In the same way that people absorb information differently, people need different lengths of time to be able to understand it. And this is another big thing that we need to, in a remote organization, change our thinking around. Companies have been obsessed with now, that ability to ask a question and expect an immediate response. In many cases, this is a sign of lack of planning on our part. Why should a lack of planning on our part constitute an emergency on someone else's? So never expect someone to respond to you immediately unless it's a true emergency. So ASAP is never a good response when someone asks you, when do you need it by? And if we do need a high level of interactivity, team meetings are still a valid way of doing it. But we should use meetings judiciously. We should consider them a fallback, not the default. And when you are having a team meeting, there are certain techniques that we can use to improve the quality of the outcomes we would have. In Turn the Ship Around by David Marquette, he talks about the importance of certifying and not briefing. So with certifying, you share the materials ahead of time so that everyone has a chance to review them, form opinions on them. And then in the meeting itself, you then discuss the pros, cons, you confirm understanding of that, and you finish with a go, no go around alignment on that item. And it has many benefits. It creates an increased focus within the meeting itself. Everybody actively engages in the meeting. If you know you're going to have to talk about it, you'll generally prepare a little more for it, rather than passive briefings. And it promotes leader-to-leader interactions. In the same way I said leaders have to lead in a remote working environment, this is exactly the patterns of behavior that starts to encourage that. And then finally, you can also have a shorter duration of the meeting. So the amount of time where everyone needs to be available can be shorter, again, because you've done a large amount of that understanding work up front. Group chat is another option, and it's one that has become incredibly pervasive at VIX and many other companies that I've worked at. And this might sound strange, but I'm actually of the opinion that group chat in many ways is quite harmful. it can be incredibly effective at hashing out quick ideas between one or two people. Do we do this? What are your thoughts on that? And move on. But I do work with many of my engineers, and I see tabs open all day with many group chats, and it's really being like a meeting with no agenda all day long. And this is a very easy pattern to fall into unless we can codify that idea of don't treat chat as an instant response tool, particularly in group scenarios. And also know that when you should exit a particular channel, so that if you're in chat, when does it then become better placed to go to long form, like a wiki article, or again, a technical writing document? And the general rule of thumb for me is that if there's more than 3 or 4 back and forths, and that doesn't mean, hey, how's it going? All good. It's about 3 questions and answers around specific design details on that. So again, making it referenceable, accessible, and visible to all. Writing that down in a more accessible, persistent store can be a good move just in terms of longer term knowledge management as well. And if that's about the communication channels within the team, there's something broader that we need to consider as well, and that's trust. And trust is really the catalyst for high-performing teams. You cannot get a high-performing team without trust. And one of the biggest things that erodes trust is asymmetry of information. That is where some members of a team know more about a particular item or have additional context in comparison to other people. And there's some classic examples of this. So the used car salesman typically knows a huge more about the car you're looking to buy. There's always a inbuilt distrust. Are they telling me everything? Are they holding some of this information back? And where we've typically seen asymmetry of information is between people working in the office, in the hub, and then people working remotely, or again, in more smaller offices around sort of the edge of the organization from there. And you could really identify information asymmetry by remote workers needing to poll for information updates. If you're constantly getting questions, what's happening here? Has this happened yet? What happened with this particular person or this particular policy? This is a strong indicator that there is information asymmetry across your organization, and you need to look at the communication strategy to ensure that you get a level playing field across all of your colleagues. The biggest defense that we can have against information siloing and asymmetry of information is to make work visible. So for instance, in the communication architecture, where can you make information visible to everyone? So for instance, for anything in terms of broader portfolio delivery at VIX, we use Miro for that, and a Miro board that shows all of the teams, what they're working on, their progress towards a particular payment milestone for a customer, and any of the risks. There's an information radiator that shows everything that anyone would need to know about the status of delivery across VIX. And we use that board in a very asynchronous way. We also use Miro, similar to Mural, for highly interactive retrospectives. But in this case, for that board, there was no expectation that it will be updated immediately. It's updated for 2 points in the week from there. And that's the consistency model that we apply to it. So it's very much an asynchronous form of updates. But the tool is semi-synchronous. It's how you choose to use it. So for team level comms, choose asynchronous often and synchronous seldom. And this is a skill that teams need to build. This does not come naturally. So to embrace remote working, we need to rewire ourselves in terms of how we communicate. Meetings are expensive. So a 1 hour meeting with 5 people is not a 1 hour meeting. It is actually a 5 hour meeting. Share the context up front to minimize the time, but also promote stronger leader-leader interactions within those sessions. And chat is great for quick exchanges, but be wary of group chat. In the same way that a conference call with 3 or 4 people can be incredibly effective, you suddenly increase that to 15 people and things can get chaotic very quickly. You can lose context the question that you needed to answer is suddenly 5 or 6 comments down. And it creates a huge need to context switch across. And information siloing erodes trust. Always look at transparency as being the best defense for this. And when we're looking at an individual team member, what can you do to promote transparency in your organization? And it's really embracing communication, that more than ever, this is a core skill that we all need to be successful. And the key guidance here is working out loud. So taking all of your work and making it observable, making it clear, making it transparent, not just what you're doing, but also how you're approaching it. And talking and narrating around it. So typically that could be a blog if you wanted to do things externally, but it could also be just updates to your teams in terms of, this is what I'm doing, here's the challenges that this is what I've learned. So being able to talk about what you're doing, it not only shows stronger alignment, but also other people might be looking to learn the same thing. And then you create aligned learning opportunities from there. And it also strikes the heart of transparency being more important than ever in companies in this remote first world. So team member comms, things you can do yourself. Make your work visible and explain your approach and thinking. Set yourself clear learning goals and look for opportunities to share these with other people. At VIX, we use OKRs for this. OKRs at a department level are about strategic alignment. OKRs at an individual level are about learning goals. And a key result is the product of a conversation between that colleague and their line manager and represents a mutual commitment to a learning outcome. So it's how we support colleagues to have a growth mindset and learn. And it is also about providing structure on an outcome based for the one-to-ones that we have as well. So again, improving the quality of the communication and the pastoral care between a colleague and their particular team lead. And be open to feedback. You will find that it will come in many forms, sometimes wrapped with a layer of positivity and sometimes not. So what if we're going to take out our crystal ball and look a little beyond 2020? What's the predictions we can have for future workplaces? One of the big surprises that I had as part of going through the last 6 months or so of remote working is that communication initially worsened within individual regions, but it improved across regions, so between regions. And that's because the shift to remote working had inadvertently democratized communication. So finally, everyone was using the same tools and the same mediums to communicate. We weren't having people talking in corridors or hallways and then making decisions and not sharing them more broadly. Everyone was using and is using the same tools. And then we can have a single approach for how we build our skills using those tools and those skills, and we codify it in the communication architecture. We have a single experience to provide. However, we have companies looking past from there and then saying, what will the future look like? Could we employ a hybrid model whereby we can have some people working in the office and some people working from home? That could be effective. I personally have concerns around this, and that I feel it will take a lot of effort to get right. So finally, all of the democratization and single paths for communication, you've then created a two-speed economy again. We will have to rely on people, if you're having those corridor conversations, to then share and publish and broadcast that out as well. But again, that's a behavior you would need to embed within your teams and a skill you would need to grow. And hybrid working environments demand that multiple colleague experiences are delivered. So by that, having one experience for people working in an office, working alongside other teams, and one person then working remotely, what does onboarding look like? What does that experience look like through it? So we've seen that colleagues, based on studies, that colleagues who have been part of a structured onboarding experience are 80% likely to last at your company for more than 2 to 3 years. So again, landing that first experience with your company is incredibly valuable. But if you have multiple ways of delivering that, will those experiences be equal? That's a massive challenge. So I'll leave with a call out that's saying that while we as companies and really the world had very little time to prepare for remote working, we should be incredibly careful and considered in any decision that we take to either stop or change it. There are many incredibly positive aspects to remote working today. And can we commit? And I'm convinced that committing to remote working will yield not only better outcomes for the organizations, but also for colleagues and people working within those companies themselves. It gives colleagues, it gives all of us a chance to achieve a better work-life balance. And it also provides us flexibility to work for different employers without having to move cities or move areas. So we've covered quite a lot of ground in this talk today. We started with culture, and we saw that it is absolutely fundamental to, first of all, recognize and embrace the cultural differences amongst your teams. We've seen there's massively valuable material around Erin Meyer's The Culture Map and Hofstadter's Cultural Dimensions that provide insight into how to communicate effectively cross-culturally. We've seen that it's not easy, but the benefits of doing so far outweigh trying to create a monoculture where we avoid the situation. At an organization level comms, we saw that building alignment is absolutely key in any messaging that we provide. The way to promote effective distributed decision-making with communications is through the establishment of a communication architecture. So a set of documents that define the policies, procedures, approaches, channels, and when to use and how to use them. And this forms a core part of any onboarding experience, how to be successful, how to be able to communicate effectively within the organization. We saw announcements. Announcements through email is less than ideal. You don't have a persistent, referenceable, and accessible version of it. New starters might not be able to have access to it. Instead, put them in a centralized location, but train people to look at that content by using the existing channels. So send an email or an update that then directs people back to that content. And do it in a way that mirrors the access path within the application itself. So again, people can see how the data is structured and find relevant or similar data if they need to as well. We saw the value of context in messaging, and that we should always start with why. Typically reversing how we would send a message before, of starting with the what, then the how, then the why. Starting with the why is incredibly powerful. And again, I've included a wonderful TED talk by Simon Sinek in the resources slide at the end of it. It's about 20 minutes, but incredibly worth your time. At the team level, we then saw the multiple options that we have in terms of two-way communication. We saw that teams rely on meetings is an anti-pattern, or in terms of it implies a high tax or a high level of coupling between teams. So embracing asynchronous forms of communication is incredibly valuable to, again, let teams operate in a remote working environment. We've seen with chat can be effective for solving immediate challenges. How does something work? But can become abused in the same way that a large conference call can, when you have multiple participants there all day, and it can become difficult to manage and a huge source of distraction for teams. We've seen that trust is incredibly important in teams and one of the vital ingredients for building a high-performing team. And effective communication and removing knowledge silos and providing equal context is absolutely vital to this. We saw that questions around polling status updates or questions around the status of particular policies or any procedural items is again indicative of information asymmetry within your organization. These are things that should cause action to address. Finally, at the individual level, we saw that working out loud can be a wonderful way of not only sharing the work that you're doing, and that can be internally or externally to your organization as well, but also then building aligned learning opportunities with other colleagues and expanding your network when you go through as well. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their attendance today. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. And I have 5 minutes for questions if there's anything from the floor.